It was a simple tweet about human rights that outraged Saudi Arabia. The government has now suspended flights and ended trade ties with Canada. But is international criticism enough to improve human rights in the kingdom? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Saudi Arabia considers Canada's comments on human rights in the kingdom to be an interference in its affairs that requires what it calls a sharp response. It has expelled the Canadian ambassador and recalled its envoy from Ottawa. Its state-owned airline has suspended direct flights to Toronto, and the government says it will end trade and investment ties. It all began with a tweet from Canada's Foreign Affairs Ministry stating concerns over Saudi Arabia's arrest of rights activists and demanding their immediate release. One of those activists mentioned in that tweet is Samar Badawi. A relative of Canadian citizens, Badawi and fellow activist Nassima al-Sadah were arrested last month. Badawi is the recipient of the 2012 International Women of Courage Award, who's known for challenging Saudi Arabia's male guardianship system. She is the sister of blogger Raif Badawi and the former wife of lawyer Walid Abu al-Khair, who are both serving lengthy jail terms in Saudi prisons. The Canadian foreign minister says her country will not back down.
We will always speak up for human rights. We will always speak up for women's rights around the world. And I do also want to say, when it comes to the Badawi family, Ensaf Haidar is a Canadian citizen, and she and her family therefore merit special attention from the Government of Canada. And a lot of Canadian civil society has been speaking up for her. It's something that we do. We stand up for Canadians and their families around the world.
Earlier on Monday, Saudi Foreign Minister Adel al-Jubeir tweeted saying, "The kingdom doesn't interfere in the affairs of other countries, and we will not accept any interference attempts. We will deal with this firmly." The surprising Canadian stance is based on misleading information. The prosecution of those mentioned is subject to our judicial systems that guarantee their rights. Saudi authorities have arrested a number of people in recent days. More than a dozen women's rights campaigners were detained in May on charges of undermining national security. Some have since been released. Dozens of clerics have also been arrested, including leading preachers Salman al-Auda, Awad al-Qarni, and Safar al-Hawali. Several high-profile human rights activists are in jail, and some have been referred to a counterterrorism tribunal for trial. And Saudi Arabia has imprisoned nearly all the founders of the banned Saudi Civil and Political Rights Association. All right, let's bring in our panel. Joining us in London, Rathna Begum, a senior researcher in women's rights at Human Rights Watch. In Leeds, Sultan Barakat, director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at the Doha Institute. And in Washington, D.C., Imad Harb, Director of Research and Analysis at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Welcome to you all. Rathna, I want to start with you. We are really in uncharted territory these days when it comes to detention of activists in Saudi Arabia. I mean, there was a time not that long ago when the arrest of so many prominent women might be viewed as something that would engender a lot of anger in Saudi society. Isn't that the case?
Absolutely. This is an unprecedented and unrelenting crackdown on all forms of dissent and criticism in the country. Now, the difference this time is that it's highly unusual for the Saudi authorities to, one, actually detain the activists and at the same time take credit for their reforms. In previous times, of course, they've arrested and harassed and intimidated activists, but never in a manner in which there was a concerted campaign of arrests. Before, it was always in relation to something. So the women defied the driving ban, so they were arrested. So it was sudden acts that led to them actually being arrested. This time round, they were rounded up and arrested in the middle of the night from their homes in such a concerted way with a smear campaign, something we've not seen before either. Saudi authorities are launching a very social media campaign to malign the reputation within Saudi Arabia, and at the same time trying to make sure that they have a PR-savvy campaign in order to ensure that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is able to take full credit for the reforms that these women have been championing for years.
Imad, let me ask you, does this crackdown and also this rift now with Canada, Does this have a risk at all of backfiring on Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman from either inside or outside the kingdom?
Well, tell you the truth, I mean, how can it not backfire on him? Unfortunately, this is an almost irrational action. I mean, it's just an emotional impulse, and he acted on it. I don't think that it really makes his case any better domestically or internationally for what he says. He's trying to rule a kingdom that's basically on the cusp of modernization and all that. I don't think that modernization comes by arresting women or any civil society activist or anybody for that matter. So I really doubt that this is going to help the Saudi cause at all.
Sultan, does the fact that Canada granted citizenship in early July to Insaf Haider, who is the wife of jailed Saudi blogger and activist Raif Badawi, does that play into this? I mean, how angry was Saudi Arabia about that? And has that added, fuel to this fire, that emerged because of the tweet?
Well, I think the citizenship was granted earlier this year, but the asylum was given back in 2015. And Raif Badawi was imprisoned in Saudi Arabia in 2012. So Canada, in a way, has something to justify why they should be concerned about what's going on in Saudi Arabia. However, I think probably the medium in which and the way in which they reacted was very unfortunate. I think there are two stories here. One is the crackdown within Saudi Arabia, and the second is a lesson to all that you cannot really conduct foreign policy based on tweets. And when they expressed their concern, of course, I don't think that came directly from Madame Freeland, but it has been, she got implicated in it. And the real worry is the way it escalated so quickly over the last few days. And I think, again, the Saudi totally irrational responses or series of responses that followed that tweet have made the situation much worse. And in these circumstances, I think it will very quickly grow beyond that initial family problem and the sister-in-law of Raif Badawi.
Ralphna, if we could just step back for a minute, because our viewers are hearing a lot of names they may not be familiar with, Saudi human rights activists, both female and male, who have been detained the past few months. Let's talk specifically for a moment about Samar Badawi. She is the person who was mentioned by name in that tweet by the Canadian embassy in Saudi Arabia. Let's talk for a moment about Samar Badawi. Of course, she's known for being a very prominent human rights activist herself, a recipient of a U.S. State Department award in 2012, formerly married to Walid Abul Khair, a very prominent rights lawyer in Saudi Arabia who's been jailed, sister of Raif Badawi, very prominent blogger who's in jail in Saudi Arabia. Why would she be targeted now?
That's the question that's actually been on many people's minds who actually know Samar Badawi. Samar is a prominent women's rights activist, not, as you say, not just awarded, but for the very activism that she's campaigned on in Saudi Arabia. She herself was a victim of the abusive male guardianship system. She fought in the courts to remove the guardianship from her father to her brother. She also sued the government in a number of occasions because of discriminatory policies, like, for instance, the driving ban. So she sued the government in trying to ensure, because they didn't give her a driver's license back some years ago. She also sued the government for not allowing her to stand in the municipal council elections, a fight that they later won because in part of these actions. Now, Samar had actually gone fairly quiet. There was an intimidation campaign by the authorities against women's rights activists, and they were clearly concerned by that some of them may still be speaking to the media around the time of the driving ban being lifted, because that was a time when international journalists were flying into Saudi Arabia to cover this reform. And so a lot of these women were arrested, but Samar wasn't. And why she's been arrested now is unclear, but she is not the only one who's been arrested. 2 other women have also been arrested, and it seems as if they're trying to get rid of all vestiges of activists who may have the potential to speak out, or just to make it very clear that you simply, even for your previous activism, you cannot stay within the country without being prosecuted. And just to be aware, Samar Badawi actually had a travel ban on her before she was actually arrested, and this has been going on for some time now.
Ahmad, U.S. leadership, has been close for decades with Saudi Arabia, but, they have been critical in the past, at least somewhat, of human rights policies in Saudi Arabia. That seems to have stopped with the Trump administration. Is the fact that the U.S. is no longer being vocal when it comes to perceived rights abuses in Saudi Arabia. Is that emboldening the Saudi regime?
Well, unfortunately, yes. The White House has basically absconded on the issue of protecting democracy and human rights around the world, and including in the Gulf. And Saudi Arabia is one of those states which Washington basically tries always to avoid, to criticize. But yeah, I mean, last year's State Department report on human rights mentioned issues of trespasses and things like that in Saudi Arabia. But yes, on the other hand, I'd say that maybe the current Saudi leadership is not necessarily waiting for the Trump administration to approve or disapprove of what they're trying to do. They have a program. They have a program of modernization and all that, and they think that all of this is going to affect their modernization efforts, which is definitely wrong. So I doubt that the Trump administration, whatever the Trump administration does or criticizes or does not criticize, I think the Saudi leadership will continue to do whatever it wants to do regarding human rights and democratic development.
Sultan, critics of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau have charged that he has not been strong enough in the past of his criticism of Saudi Arabia. And they say the fact that he is allowing arms deals to Saudi Arabia that were negotiated before his tenure to go through, that shouldn't happen. And some have said that this criticism that has come up in the last few days is really just essentially a PR move to deflect criticism that he's been receiving because of the arms deal. What do you say to all that? Is there merit to that?
Well, Canada, like Sweden and other Scandinavian countries, have declared human rights and feminist agenda very much central to their foreign policy. And they've been very proud of this. They go around the world speaking about this policy. And I think that has raised expectations, particularly within human rights corners, advocates, southern countries mostly, that they expect a stronger stand from Canada and those countries that are fast developing a lobby in that direction. Now, that hasn't been forthcoming. And of course, the real disappointment has been around Yemen. The whole intervention in Yemen attracted very little criticism from those countries, direct criticism, and from the Americans as well. Now, I go back to the point that I think it's been an unfortunate incident, and had the Saudis chosen not to respond to the tweet, probably nobody would have noticed it, or very few would have noticed it. I don't think conducting foreign policy and affecting change in Saudi Arabia is going to be carried out on Twitter. I think the Canadians should have and could have written to the Saudis, shown more support, and they may be behind the scenes they're doing all this, and the Saudis are not responding. But there are other channels to place pressure on the Saudis at this very important, critical time, given their agenda of modernization and given their very broad interventions around the Middle East. So they do need critical friends. And I think Canada could be one of those friends that shows the Saudi the right way occasionally, but it has to be done in a way that the Saudis feel appropriate and not insulting.
Roth, now Amnesty International has called for the international community to speak out against rights abuses in Saudi Arabia. Can we expect to be hearing more from countries, specifically the UK and France at this time?
If the UK, France and other EU states, other countries that are allies to Saudi Arabia care about human rights, care about women's rights as they're supposed to, according to their charters and within their own laws, they should be standing up and declaring their support for what Canada has said and urging the release for all of these activists in Saudi Arabia. The fact that they have been silent so far is deafening. The silence is absolutely deafening, and it sort of leaves the Saudi Arabian authorities much more emboldened, because what they're really doing is they're trying to silence all of their critics, not just internally, but externally. By reacting so harshly and so aggressively against the Canadian authorities, they want to make it clear these are the consequences of what it means when you criticize us. But the UK, France and others, if they stood up at the same time and said, no, in these cases you can't call simply criticizing you, simply urging you to release some activists as unlawful interference, then that would then show that Saudi Arabia has to continue trading with many countries, and if all of these countries stood up and said something, they would then be pushed, they would be required to actually respond in a more adequate manner. But right now they're getting away with this idea that the so-called interference, when it's just a normal and adequate criticism that is absolutely reasonable in the circumstance, they're getting away with that.
Imad, Saudi Arabia, of course, has been trying to burnish its image, especially with the West. I mean, you had Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, take that trip to the United States, really put on a charm offensive with potential investors and with government figures. How does something like this help that? I mean, we keep talking about this in the past few months, even in the run-up to women driving in Saudi Arabia. Finally, they were granted the women to drive. And then in the run-up to that, some of the most prominent activists who called for the right to drive, they were arrested, and there was outrage because of that. I mean, what is the end game here when it comes to public relations in Saudi Arabia and all this?
Well, for one thing, there is unfortunately a little ignorance of what the function of public relations is. I mean, you have to really always work on your image abroad. But I think the underlying truth here is that the Saudi leadership and many leaderships like it consider economic relations to be separate from political relations or political reputations around the world. So I think the Crown Prince maybe thinks that if I strike enough deals with companies and make sure that, for instance, the American president is happy with how many jobs I'm helping to create in the United States, maybe they won't say anything about our human rights record. But it's very difficult today in our day and age to really separate economics from politics or from the reputations of states. This is it's not helpful, and it's not only this. I mean, the war in Yemen is obviously not helpful. Yes, the American administration is happy because they're buying weapons to use in the war and all that. But killing children and women in different places, and by the way, they're not the only one doing the killing. A whole bunch of others are doing the killing. But it really does not serve any purpose of public relations here.
Sultan, we were just talking the economic aspect of this, and I could ask you to expand on some of what Imad was saying. I mean, Saudi Arabia is going to great lengths these days to tell potential investors that it is open for business. There is the Crown Prince's Saudi Vision 2030 initiative. How does this help that? At a time when they're trying to bring investors to Saudi Arabia, wouldn't potential investors be scared?
Of course they would. I don't think it's helping at all. I think it's another episode of shooting themselves in the foot as a result of this rushed reaction and reliance on Facebook and Twitter and so on as a form of communication. The trade relations between Canada and Saudi Arabia are around maybe $4 billion a year, mostly exports to Canada from Saudi Arabia. And they have a huge program of higher education. Saudi is going to Canada for education, health, etc. And stopping all this all of a sudden is really causing a lot of hardship to the Saudi citizens themselves first. To suddenly expect students to switch and look for other places where they cannot continue their studies in Canada, or to ask patients to look for alternative sources of medication and so on. It's too difficult for those individuals. And I think the Saudis should show more concern to their own citizenship and really react in a much more measured way, which is becoming extremely difficult given the way Mohammed bin Salman seems to have given the rein to some of his advisors to conduct policy over Twitter. The moment they tweet, it's very difficult to retract. They find it too embarrassing to say sorry. Even when they published this very unfortunate image of an aircraft flying towards Toronto, in English, they apologized. In Arabic, they did not dare to apologize. They just withdrew it. Now, I think someone should really be taking control And if Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman is serious about his modernization reform,
Sultan, I'm sorry to interrupt. I should just mention there was an apology by those who issued that tweet of the plane, the image of the plane. There was an apology that was issued hours after that was tweeted.
There was an admission that it was inappropriate, but the text in Arabic never said sorry.
Okay.
But I may have read a wrong tweet, but this is what I read in Arabic. In English,
okay,
it clearly apologized for causing any stress.
All right, thanks for clarifying. Rathna, you heard Sultan there talk about how he believes that Saudi leadership should show greater care or empathy to their citizens. Is there any way to actually gauge what Saudi citizens are feeling? I mean, clearly, people in Saudi Arabia are afraid to speak out because of the repercussions. If they're seen to be seen criticizing the government, there could be severe consequences. So can you actually gauge what the Saudi public feels about what the government is doing right now?
Unfortunately, you can't. We have no idea really what the vast majority of Saudi Arabians really feel about what the government is doing. I think there is a genuine concern, of course, that the Saudi authorities are really cracking down on dissent, but the fear now has penetrated that they cannot say anything. I mean, these are Saudi Arabians who are prominent on social media. They're like one of the biggest users of Twitter in the country, in the world, I mean. And yet, when you look at the kind of reactions like of what's happening with Canada, the vast majority of those attacking and the sort of the things that are happening are usually Twitter bots. They're usually done in a certain kind of manner that suggests these are on recruits. These are not regular Saudi Arabians who are showing outrage about what Saudi Arabians are doing, about what Saudi Arabians' allies are saying about them. And so it's not really clear what the Saudi Arabians are able to say or think. We will never really know because the Saudi authorities will not allow a polling, won't allow for the outrage to really to come out in public. And if anything, those who have been somewhat critical, so for instance, after the arrests of the women's rights activist, one woman had tweeted her support of those women who had been arrested. She was arrested shortly after. Her friend then posted the letter that she had prepared if she was arrested in that instance, and then that friend was arrested. Now that friend was not an activist. She simply posted something her friend had asked her to do online, and the previous friend was also not really a prominent activist either. She just showed support for these activists. So it's very, very clear. You cannot not only be an activist, you cannot express yourself, but you also cannot show support for these activists. So they are really going out of the way to silence Saudis, to even to prohibit them from coming out and speaking their minds. And what we'll only really see are the Twitter bots that will come out in support of the Saudi government.
Sultan, we don't have a whole lot of time left. I want to leave you with the last word here. This is not expected to have much of an impact on Canada's economy. Are the biggest losers here going to be those 15 or 16,000 students that potentially will have to leave Canada and get education elsewhere now, these Saudi students?
In the immediate terms, I think it is the Saudi students and patients who are going to suffer most, and those who do normal business, holidaying, traveling directly between Saudi Arabia and Canada. But in the long term, if this escalates further, I mean, there is a $13 billion deal, or at least initiated deal between Saudi and Canada to provide them with armored vehicles. And maybe this is a good reminder. In a way, there could be a silver lining to all this, is that you can't buy your way over issues, global issues of human rights that have become more and more central in the way we conduct our affairs. Sovereignty is important. Intervention is not acceptable. But increasingly, human rights are, there's a global agreement that you can and you should interfere and maybe make some noises or highlight issues. And only in extreme cases it could justify a responsibility to protect in certain circumstances. Now, that, of course, is not going to reach that level. But I think it's good that Canada has spoken out. It's important that other countries do the same. But we should do it in a medium and in ways, in the channels that are established for doing this sort of business through embassies and foreign policy mechanisms.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We are out of time. Thanks so much to all our guests, Rathna Begum, Sultan Barakat, and Ahmad Harb. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the entire team here, bye for now.